warding off a potential refugee threat or challenging Brussels. Hungarians vote on mandatory migrant quotas set by the European Union. Will the EU accept the referendum result, and what will it mean for the massive numbers of refugees in Europe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hazem Sikil. People in Hungary have cast their ballots in a referendum on the refugee quota system imposed by the European Union on its members. The government in Budapest wants to challenge the scheme under which refugees will be resettled in EU countries. Lawrence Lee reports from Budapest.
The Hungarian government has tried to guarantee success in this vote, spending many millions on its campaign against refugee quotas set by European Union leaders in Brussels. The billboards reading, "Take no chances," imply any refugee could be a terrorist. This echo of Donald Trump in the US presidential campaign has been deliberately pushed by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán as a defence of Christian European values.
We lose our European values and identity the way frogs are cooked in slowly heating water. Quite simply, slowly, there will be more and more Muslims who will no longer recognise Europe.
The vote isn't legally binding, but a win for Mr. Orbán would be extremely serious for the idea of European unity over the refugee crisis. On one level, a victory for the government in the referendum would mark the end of the refugee quota system, because Hungary, and indeed its neighbours, would say that they're not prepared to accept any. But on a wider level, it would be presented as a landmark victory by the government here for popular opinion against the diktats of the liberal elite in Brussels. The refugees themselves know about the referendum, but they have more basic concerns. On the border between Hungary and Serbia, doctors have treated people who've been beaten or bitten by dogs before being ejected. The Hungarian police are accused of using violence as a deliberate tactic, even against children.
They don't know where to go. So we have here psychologists, and we provide for them psychological care, but this is not enough. They just want some happier life for them.
Families have also been separated. MUSTAFA, an Afghan, crossed the Hungarian border with several family members. They were allowed into a refugee camp, but he was thrown out. He doesn't know where his relatives are now and has no way of re-entering the European Union. He's alone and stranded.
The last time I spoke to my family was 8 days ago. I have no idea where they are now. My mother is sick and she's worried about me. I can't do anything but wait.
The Hungarian government would argue it's not to blame, and the fault lies with a chaotic European response to this crisis. In its world, protection of the Schengen free travel zone for Europeans is paramount. The referendum is designed to force the rest of the EU to accept a common position, that Europe is for Europeans and nobody else. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, in Hungary.
Well, in July, EU officials finalised plans to create a common asylum system and refugee resettlement scheme. The draft law suggests all members should have the same rules of accepting asylum seekers and refugees. The crisis exposed current differences between the EU states. Each member is given a quota of refugees for resettlement based on its population and state of economy. Under the scheme, Hungary would get around 1,300 of 160,000 refugees. The new system also imposes a $280,000 fine on EU states for every refugee they refuse to accept. Well, Viktor Orbán won his third term in office in a landslide vote 2 years ago. He has been a controversial figure who strained relations with Western European countries over domestic and foreign policies, including close ties with Russia. Last year, the Hungarian Prime Minister called Europe's refugee crisis a German problem, as that is the country that those arriving in the EU would like to go to. He also said Hungarians have the right to not to live together with populous Muslim communities. Viktor Orbán's ruling party is facing a challenge from the far-right Jobbik party in the parliamentary elections in 2018. Some analysts suggest the referendum is part of his strategy to look powerful and patriotic. And here is the question that the voters in Hungary are being asked. Do you want the European Union to be able to mandate the obligatory resettlement of non-Hungarian citizens into Hungary, even without the approval of the National Assembly? Well, time now to bring in our guests in Budapest. We have George Schöpflin, member of the European Parliament for Hungary and member of Orbán's Fidesz party. In Berlin, Bodo Weber, Senior Associate at the Democratization Policy Council. And in London, John Dalhusen, Director of the Europe and Central Asia Programme at Amnesty International. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. So, George Schöpflin, let me start with you. Why is Hungary doing this?
Basically, Hungary is doing this for a number of reasons. One is the compulsory quota is generally understood to be beyond the powers of the Commission. The Commission does not have the power to set a compulsory quota. Indeed, the whole issue is slightly bizarre because it's still under appeal at the Luxembourg Court, the European Court of Justice. When the court will decide will probably next year sometime. Secondly, the figure is notionally 1,900 and something, but it's a dynamic figure. If Hungary accepts this figure, the principle this year, the Commission has said they will continue to send more and more people, and in any case, with family reunions, the number will grow geometrically. An enormous number whom actually Hungary can't afford to house. We are not Germany, we're a much poorer country. In Germany, a refugee gets 30 euros a day. If you add that up, that's well in excess of what a Hungarian gets in a year. Thirdly, the point is we know that there is a linkage between those who come to Europe and terrorism. Several of the people involved in the atrocities at Bataclan in Paris spent time in Budapest last year. Hungary has the third largest Jewish community in Europe. The government feels that it has an obligation to protect it. And clearly the presence of a sizable migrant community would provide the shelter in the way that, let's say, Molenbeek does in Paris, in Brussels, I mean to say. So we do not want this. And then, if you think about it, who has the right to decide with whom they want to live? It's a basic civic right for a country to be able to, people of a country to be able to say, these are the people I want to live together with. These are the people I don't want to live together with. Last point, I think, is that the presence of large numbers of incomers would cause the Hungarian population serious concerns. That's certainly been my experience while I was campaigning, because of the fear of the unknown. We don't know what this would actually mean to Hungary, what this would mean to the future, there are countless other problems that Hungary has to confront. We really don't need this one in addition to all the others.
All right, Bodo Weber, what is your perspective on what's happening here? And this is seen as well as a direct response to the authority of the European Union.
You see, I think when we go back to the origin of the refugee relocation scheme from September last year, we had a serious crisis, and I think there were some mistakes done back in September that in a way, caused a kind of confrontation between German leadership and the coalition of willing member states on the one side and the Visegrad countries on the other side. That I think was unnecessary because in a way, unfortunately, two things were linked. The refugee crisis urgent response on the European Union and the wider question of the reform, the common European asylum policy, So I think there was a major mistake, but that does not free Hungary from the policy EDAS, which has nothing to do with this mistake, and it's not contributing to solving both issues. And Mr. Schöpflin has already presented it. It is not about the European Commission's authorities, The decision was done by the majority, a qualified vote majority of the 28 Interior Minister of the European Council, last year. So it was a legally binding decision, and if Hungary really respects the European institution and its legal obligations within the EU, it would wait. It had challenged the decision at the European Court. and cannot ask its citizens and misleading its citizens that they have a right to decide something that is legally binding here, because by questioning a decision that is legally binding, if it upholds the court check, you're basically asking the voters without telling them they are challenging Hungary's obligations as a member of the European Union, And on the other side, you have a problem here because what the Hungarian government is doing for many years is, especially since the European refugee crisis, you're basically leading a populist campaign, labeling, and Mr. Schöpflin has probably done it a few minutes ago again, labeling, branding refugees collectively as terrorists and criminals. The problem why we had among refugees terrorists last year that were linked to the Paris attacks is not because generally there's a general problem with these refugees from war-torn areas. The problem is that for more than a decade, the common European asylum system is broken, and nobody has ever, until we had this major crisis, had the will, not Germany, not other countries, to reform the system. That's the Dublin system, and everybody knew that this crisis is coming, and everybody, took a blind eye on it. So we were, finally facing the issue when we could not avoid facing it.
John Dalhuisen, what concerns do you?
Let me give you one last sentence. By the way the Orban government is dealing, let's say, the asylum amendments last year with closing the fence, where it basically unilaterally took itself out of the common European asylum policy and accepted this division of competencies when it entered the member state as a member state. It basically, it does not contribute to getting for the EU to get to a common European policy and a common responsibility.
John Dalhuisen, what concerns does this bring up for you? I know as well you want to respond to what you've just heard earlier from our guest in Budapest.
Well, I mean, I think the bottom line is this. Mr. Orban, the Fidesz party, have been assiduous in characterizing refugees as poison, as being inimical to Europe and the future downfall of Europe. Let's be very clear. By far the most poisonous element in European politics and society today is the kind of populist rhetoric for which Mr. Orban is posing now as the cheerleader in Europe. This is the intravenous injection of poison into the minds of a European electorate through lie after lie after lie, some of which we've just heard repeated, and which in this referendum has just been full of the most toxic, noxious falsehoods you can possibly imagine. And this has been presented perhaps in an articulate and pleasant way by Mr. Schöpflin, who I'm sure is a very nice fellow. But that's really what is at heart here. And the European Union basically has a choice. Either it responds to a modest refugee crisis through coordinated, collective, shared action that displays solidarity both towards refugees and towards other European countries, or it closes its borders and descends into infighting between European countries, neither of which are in the interests of refugees or a broader European electorate, or indeed Hungarian citizens.
All right, well, I should tell you at this point that our guest in Budapest, George Schöpflin, is no longer available. He will not be taking part in the debate for the rest of the show. That is his choice, but we will push on with the discussion. Bodo Weber in Berlin, if I could come back to you on this. Now, this referendum is not legally binding in any way. So the question has been brought up as to whether this is just a PR exercise designed partly as well to distract from the problems in Hungary at the moment and the economic problems that the government is facing there. What do you say to that?
You see, I think that's exactly what it is, but I think it's even more serious than just a PR thing. I mean, it comes in a row of very populist referendums, from the one on the Brexit to the one we recently had in Bosnia-Herzegovina last weekend. This one is a fake referendum in a way, and it makes a mockery of the idea of the participatory democracy. I think you see from Mr. Orban's statement yesterday, when the polls show that the referendum would most probably not reach the quorum and not be legally valued, that he announced that he would nevertheless, use this referendum as if it has legally succeeded. I think that very clearly shows that the biggest threat to Hungary are not the migrants and the refugee crisis. The bigger threat to Hungary over the last few years is the undermining of democracy and the rule of law by the Orban government.
John Dalhusen, there are concerns that have been raised, not just by politicians on the right in Europe, but many moderate, well-respected centrist politicians who have talked about the need to deal with the issue of migrants coming into Europe very quickly and being a strain on resources there. And that is a policy that needs to be coordinated across Europe. What is your take on that?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, Europe needs to get organized. It certainly doesn't need to get urbanized, if I may. And it's clear that, I mean, one of the very things that this referendum was set up in opposition to, an organized, structured relocation system for redistributing refugees arriving en masse in a small number of countries, was again a sensible policy aimed at addressing a number of the imbalances in Europe's current migration policy, which is coming under strain at the moment. So indeed, I think just as it is ultimately, it's irresponsible to be looking at a refugee crisis, at migratory pressures that there are at the moment, without considering how this can be managed in an orderly, organized way. It's crucial that European politicians are able to sell a set of policies, a vision to a European public that is, on the one hand, yes, we have obligations to refugees under international law, but also straightforward, humane ones. But also, Europe is not an open house for every economic migrant that wants to come. We will process fairly. We will return those who we judge not to have an asylum application that's well-founded. That's crucial. And to set up a system that is coherent across the whole EU, that distributes responsibility, cost, and responsibility subsequently for integrating refugees. This is perfectly possible. We're not talking about numbers that render this an undeliverable goal if European countries come together and societies remain open and robust in responding to this challenge.
Bodo Weber, there's an issue here as well that goes beyond migrants. It goes beyond what's happening in Hungary. It is a concern that's been brought up in many of the member nations of the EU, is that many of them see this migrant issue as a challenge to their sovereignty, a challenge to their authority. They see this as, we don't just want Brussels telling us what to do all the time. This is something that that the European Union as an organization is going to have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. You see, I think this migrant crisis, the refugee crisis that was completely avoidable, as I said earlier, it turned into an existential crisis without needed to be, because, you know, like all the last 10 years, we had here the EU, you know, in its permanent crisis mode, starting with the Euro crisis, approaching it the same way with which it had muddled through over the various crises over the last decade, you know, and that was a combination of late reactive leadership by Germany and the coalition of the willing, but one, you know, that is trying to manage crisis and trying at the same time, as our Chancellor is not a great strategist or visionary, to avoid dealing, you know, with the structural deficiency of the EU in a strategic way. And you see here, you know, that this policy, exactly with the relocation scheme and the resistance from many countries, starting from the Visegrad countries and later, you know, through the collapse of the coalition of the willing under populist pressure, then this policy has hit a wall, you know. And, you know, so I think this is a very important wake-up call for Europe, not just because, you know, this mode also contributed to the Brexit, for the EU to, you know, start to you know, show real leadership, show strategic leadership, and really start solving all the strategic, you know, structural deficiencies and issues, from the lack of a joint common European asylum policy that is based on something different than the Dublin thing. And I think my organization just has made a proposal in a new paper how I think you could find even a compromise solution for the immediate refugee crisis, because the EU-Turkey deal is not a sustainable solution between the Visegrad countries and Germany and the other countries, and for a permanent solution for a sustainable European asylum policy. But I think, you know, overall this needs a completely different approach. There has been a huge lack across all member states of political leadership for the last decade. Germany has shown the most leadership, but it has been, limited through the style through which Ms. Merkel has really, seized leadership. It is not, at least so far, it was not able, and structured to solve structural issues and have the big debates. We avoided the big debates and managed through a couple of crises, but the overall crisis of the EU as such has only deepened. So I think, yes, this is a wake-up call, and the real crisis between the refugee crisis that did not have to be is the crisis of the EU itself, and it needs to be approached. Otherwise, we see what we've seen in the refugee crisis. Governments, turning away from a joint European solution, trying to survive politically by giving in afraid to populist pressure, and it doesn't pay out. It didn't pay out in the case of Austria, it didn't pay out in the case of Sweden, in the case of France. Even the Slovak government in the last election has not, had any gain from, seizing a populist agenda. And even in Hungary, I mean, even with all this populist policy, the polls have dramatically fallen over the last few years for Mr. Orban's party. And I mean, if the referendum comes out without a quorum, you see, that this permanent populist mobilization has limits, but, it's just a question whether all the governments will recognize these limits before they completely destroy the European Union.
John Dalhuisen, there is a European Union summit coming up in the next few days. Migration is sure to be a key issue there once again. What would you like to see from that?
Well, I think Europe has to be putting together collective solutions on the table. Some of this indeed is about the common asylum policy, a rethink of that, a redistribution of refugees and resources, asylum seekers and resources across the European Union. It's inevitable, it's essential, it'll have to happen. But more broadly, European Union should be looking beyond its borders, not with a sole view to restricting further entrance through a series of slightly shady deals with third countries of origin or transit, externalizing, if you will, its
You're talking about
obligations.
The deal with Turkey there.
Well, that's one of them, but it's a precursor to many others. We're seeing deals with Sudan, with Afghanistan, all sorts of deals trying to facilitate the return of migrants, many of whom are asylum seekers, many of whom in turn are in fact refugees. And this desire by the European Union to expand outwards, as it were, the controls and restrictions that it imposes on people arriving in the European Union. Some of this is sensible. Some of this will indeed contribute to a better regulation of flows. But I think the European Union has to be very careful about going down a route that ultimately just indulges the populist whims of some of Europe's most toxic leaders. And instead, I think, as my colleague, our fellow panelists was saying earlier, this is fundamentally a failure of leadership. We've had the most vocal leaders, the most strategically engaged leaders being populist leaders. And it's time for a principled, confident, liberal, refugee rights respecting leaders to assert themselves and sell to a European public a different vision, which is, I think, perfectly possible in the current climate.
What do you say, though, to the security concerns, John Dalhuisen, that have been raised about so many refugees coming from Syria?
If you look at it statistically, I mean, Europe is in no need of a refugee influx to inflate significantly the numbers of people engaged in terrorist-related activity in Europe. I don't think this is a statistically significant fact. I think the really central issue is if you have a much more organized and robust system for receiving refugees within Europe through resettlement programs or organized relocation schemes, you will reduce the capacity, the potential for unregulated, uncontrolled, unknown entry. And that, I think, is the main problem here and the big problem here. And the one that I think of European society is very right to be concerned about. So if you have an orderly influx where you can identify security threats, which are, again, very low numbers involved, then I think that is a perfectly doable proposition.
All right, and on that note, we're going to have to leave it. Bodo Weber and John Dalhuisen, thanks very much for being on Inside Story, and thank you as well to George Schöpflin, who joined us earlier. Thanks very much to you for watching, and remember, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.